So welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another session of the Delphi Economic Forum. My name is Giannis Kutsomytis. I'm sitting in for Nick Gowing, who unfortunately couldn't attend due to technical reasons. And we're happy and proud to host a distinguished U.S. official and a decorated military officer, retired General Ντέιβιντ Πετρέους. Welcome to Delphi Forum. We're happy to have you here.
Great to be with you, Giannis. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me start by asking you, recently we've seen a definite ultimate decision by the new U.S. administration to withdraw U.S. military forces from Afghanistan, and the withdrawal has already started. You've been a commander of U.S. forces for several years, and you know Afghanistan as very few people around the world. Can you give us your input on what this new development means for the stability of the region and the country, and what are the prospects of this movement?
Well, first of all, let me just note that no one wants to see endless wars end more than those who have actually participated in them and who know the loss and sacrifice and damage and so forth that inevitably accompany war. I also very generally support the emerging foreign policy of the new administration. I think very highly of the national security team that President Biden has assembled. I know them all personally from having served with them during my several positions in the Obama administration. And I respect the decision of the president. However, I fear that we will look back perhaps less than a couple of years and regret this particular decision. I'm afraid that what could develop, our forces withdraw. That also means that the 7,000 or so coalition forces will withdraw together with the 3,500 American forces. And the Afghan security forces are going to not have the kind of advice, assistance, and enablers, the close air support and drones in particular, that we've helped them with over the course of a number of years now, decades. And I fear that this could devolve into a civil war. The consequences of that would be very bad for the region, very bad for the country. You could see millions of refugees. Certainly if the Taliban are able to regain control of the country, you should expect the prospect of Al-Qaeda and now also the Islamic State reestablishing sanctuaries in the country the way Al-Qaeda enjoyed a sanctuary in eastern Afghanistan under Taliban rule when they planned the 9/11 attacks there and conducted the initial training of the attackers there as well. There could, in fact, we could see the reemergence of the militias that support the warlords of the different northern territories, provinces of Afghanistan, and perhaps a convergence on Kabul the way you saw in the wake of the collapse of the post-Soviet government of Najibullah. Which again collapsed some 2 to 3 years after the Soviet withdrawal. So again, I'm quite worried about this. I know that the administration and various officials, military intelligence, policymakers are working on trying to mitigate the risks of what I have described, which again is a worst case description and one that I hope proves incorrect. But I do fear that that could be the outcome of this. And you would also then see, women in Afghanistan consigned essentially to a world of basically house arrest and viewing the world through a veil when they are allowed to leave the home when accompanied by a male. So all of the advances of women in education, girls going to school and so forth, I fear, again, could be a thing of the past. So again, the prospects for this are, in the worst case, very concerning. I have those concerns. I have certainly shared them with individuals who are in government, discussed ways to mitigate the risks, but it's going to be very difficult because if you fully withdraw all of our forces from Afghan soil, which has also been, I should note, a very good platform for the conduct of the regional counterterrorism campaign, which included, not the least of which was the raid from eastern Afghanistan into Pakistan to bring Osama bin Laden to justice. And again, the reason we've stayed, which is to prevent Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State from reestablishing the sanctuary, as I discussed, Again, I fear that you could see some of that again, noting that all of our support aircraft and so forth will have to come out of the Gulf states, which is quite a long flight, especially since you can't fly directly over Iran, which would be the most direct route, or from an aircraft carrier parked off southern Pakistan, southwestern Pakistan, which is still a reasonable flight as well. The refueling assets that will be required will be even greater than we already have now. And of course, none of them will be flying from Afghanistan. They'll be flying from outside the country. So again, there are numerous challenges that will result from this. Again, I understand the desire to end endless wars, but we should actually recognize that what we are doing here is not ending the endless war. We are ending U.S. and therefore coalition involvement in the endless war. And I fear that the endless war could get worse. So again, sorry to start off with a somewhat bleak description of what could follow, but that's what, old intelligence chiefs get paid to do, I guess.
Yes, but let me ask you now, it's been almost 20 years since US forces have arrived in Afghanistan, also allied forces. And there is a perception in some parts of the world that this war was in vain. But I know, and history tells us, that there's been real development in the country all those years, and Islamism and jihadism have been defeated largely. So can you give us your view on what has been achieved in all those years of US and allied involvement in the country?
Sure. Well, first of all, again, we went to Afghanistan for a reason, and that was to eliminate the sanctuary in which al-Qaeda planned the 9/11 attacks when the Taliban controlled the bulk of the country. We did that. We accomplished that mission. That meant we also had to get rid of the Taliban. We have stayed for a reason, and principally that is to prevent al-Qaeda and now also the Islamic State. It has an affiliate in the Afghanistan-Pakistan region as well. We've stayed to prevent al-Qaeda and now the Islamic State from reestablishing that kind of sanctuary, something that they have tried to do repeatedly. In fact, we have discovered and destroyed, defeated these sanctuaries several times since 9/11 in eastern Afghanistan, also one that was in southern Afghanistan just a few years ago. So I think there's no doubt that they will try to come back. And we're going to have to work very hard to ensure that we can identify any sanctuary like that and once again disrupt and destroy it. But the accomplishments for Afghanistan as a country have been very considerable. Again, half the population, which was unable to go to school, girls and women, under the Taliban, now has been going to school. And so it's 4 or 5 million of them typically in any given year. My wife and I actually fund a scholarship for a woman to attend the American University of Afghanistan every year. And they've been emailing each other saying, we better study really hard because this could be our last semester in college. That's very concerning, I think. Beyond that, obviously, there's a considerable amount of infrastructure that has been built. The Afghan government has established itself. The Afghan security forces are very robust, actually. And they have been fighting very hard and dying for their country to protect what has been achieved. Noting that the Taliban has managed to erode the security situation and to expand the areas over which they control and to threaten various population centers, district and provincial capitals, and even carry out attacks in Kabul itself. You'll have seen a very horrific one in the last week or so, where 80 to 90 girls at a Hazara school were killed after school was over. There was an attack actually just in the last 24 hours against a mosque in Kabul as well, where a dozen or so Afghans were killed. These are horrific events. And again, I fear that we may see more of that. I should also note, though, as you do, again, we've been at this for 20 years. I can very much understand the frustrations, the impatience. Again, it's easy to look at what is there and to see corruption, to see illegal narcotics, to see a variety of shortcomings, mistakes, inadequacies, and again, throw up your hands and get frustrated. I personally think that what we should have done was sought we should have sought to manage the problem, because I fear that we may, as was the case when we pulled out of Iraq and then had to go back in when the Islamic State reconstituted itself there in response to actions by the Iraqi government at the time, that we may see the need to go back into Afghanistan. And that's very, very difficult, given that it is a landlocked country. It's much less accessible. We have no bases in the region at present, and we may or may not get a base in the Central Asian states, but it's doubtful that the country that might provide such a base would allow us to fly armed aircraft out of it. So again, I hope that we are looking at ways to mitigate these risks. I know that that is ongoing, and that we actually consider perhaps a base in the country still, from which we could help our Afghan partners provide a degree of assistance, try to preserve some of these important achievements that Afghan people celebrate. Barring that, I think you'll see those that have an option to leave the country exercise that option. I think you'll see families and others that won't want to live under Taliban. I mean, this is a medieval theocratic kind of regime that would be returned, and you'll see millions of refugees once again flooding into Pakistan and the other countries around Afghanistan.
Talking about Taliban and Islamic extremism, I know you are one of the most prolific experts on jihadism and extremism, and we've had in the region a surge of the dreadful Islamic State that was happily defeated, or you will tell me if it's defeated in the region. What do you see of this movement? Is it in a decline? Are there still risks of resurgence of Islamism? And we've seen actions in Northern Africa, and Sub-Saharan Africa of deadly fights from jihadists and killing innocent children, abducting students. How can we tackle this phenomenon?
Well, Giannis, I think that what we need to do is learn 5 lessons from the fighting against Islamist extremists over the last 20 or so years. The first is that they will exploit ungoverned spaces in the Muslim world. That's a given. The second is you actually have to do something about it. You cannot study this problem until it goes away. It does not go away. And in the meantime, it tends to spew violence, extremism, instability, and a tsunami of refugees into neighboring countries. In the case of, say, a geopolitical Chernobyl, the meltdown of a country that was Syria, as an example. Number 3 is generally the U.S. has to lead because of the preponderance of military capabilities that we can bring to this. But we very much want to have a coalition of the willing, and it should include Muslim countries for whom this is a potentially existential struggle in a way that it is not for, say, the countries of Europe and the United States, however significant it may be for them. The fourth is that you can't counter terrorists with just counter-terrorist force operations. You have to have a comprehensive approach, similar to what we did during the surge in Iraq when Ambassador Crocker and I were privileged to lead that particular effort. But without us doing that, and that's the big lesson of the past 20 years, is to use host nation forces, and we've been able to build them, as you have seen, in Iraq, in Syria, in Afghanistan, even in Somalia, and some places of North and Western Africa. So help the host nation forces to fight against these, providing training, equipping, advice and assistance, and enablers in particular, drones that provide intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance capabilities, and then close air support, precision munitions that can enable us to attack that which we find and confirm to be elements of terrorist groups. And then the fifth is really an important lesson, and that is that this is the fight of a generation, not a fight of a decade or a few years. There's no hill that you take and plant the flag and go home to a victory parade. You just have to keep at it. And that's why I would have preferred to have seen us keep 3,500 troops or so in Afghanistan, which is vastly fewer than the 100,000 Americans that we had when I was privileged to command the International Security Force at a time when we also had 50,000 coalition forces. So 150,000 on the ground as opposed to the 10 or 10 to 15,000 that we have right now from the entire coalition. It seems to me that that is more than affordable. It is sustainable in terms of the expenditure of blood and treasure. There's not been a single battlefield loss in Afghanistan in the past year. And again, I think our experience is that if you try to pull out of a certain location, you end up having to go back in if you have not absolutely established the conditions which will ensure that extremists cannot reconstitute themselves and come back to life. In a general sense, we have made considerable progress against various extremist groups literally around the world. By and large, they are disrupted. They don't have the kind of capability that Al-Qaeda had prior to 9/11 to plan the kind of extraordinary attacks that were the attacks of 9/11, or that we have seen in a number of other countries, including European countries, in more recent years. Nor does the Islamic State have the capability that they had when they had the caliphate that occupied much of northeastern Syria and northern Iraq, with capitals in Raqqa and Mosul, and were able to carry out enormous, actually to proselytize through social media, to recruit, to attract, to motivate, to inspire, and even to teach virtually how to carry out attacks. And we saw that tragically in a number of European countries, as you will recall. But the point here is that you have to keep after them. You cannot, again, declare victory and go home. Yes, we have defeated the Islamic State as an army. Yes, the caliphate no longer exists, although there still is the virtual caliphate, the caliphate in cyberspace, which is very difficult to destroy completely. And again, you have to stay after it. But also, we should acknowledge there are still Islamic State fighters in the form of insurgents and terrorist cells in various parts of Iraq, and also still in various parts of Syria. And of course, there are other extremist groups in Syria as well. And the same is true of East Africa, North Africa, West Africa, and locations in Asia on top of that. And again, this requires a certain degree of vigilance, of determination, of will, of focus, but it's not that much. It does not at all prevent us from rebalancing, as the phrase goes, to Asia, which is what we need to do. This is an era of renewed great power rivalries. Clearly, the most important relationship in the world, more important than all the others put together, probably is the U.S.-China relationship. And that's not just important to the U.S. and China, it's important to the rest of the world as well. And it's appropriate that that is where we focus, seeking to be firm but not needlessly provocative, trying to cooperate where we can, compete where we must, and deter, above all, what would be unthinkable. And that is, again, very appropriate. But shifting our focus there doesn't mean that we completely lose focus on these extremist groups.
You briefly mentioned the new risks in the cyberspace, and we've seen recently a very malign attack on a US pipeline that resulted in ransom, and being also, there were risks among the population. In several US states, people were afraid of regular gas shortages. So this is a new risk for societies in the West. And how can we tackle this phenomenon?
Well, we have got to do a lot more. We've got to do a lot more in the United States, and a lot more has to be done around the world. There has to be a great deal more sharing between the public and the private. The national capability in the United States has to be enhanced. The establishment of the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency under the Department of Homeland Security was a very good move. It needs additional authorities and appropriations to establish the capabilities that are needed. There's a very fine individual nominated to be the head of CISA. She, in fact, was, in a sense, one of the people that I most respected over the years, a West Point graduate, Rhodes Scholar. She commanded a battalion in the National Security Agency space, was twice in the White House, and she helped in Baghdad during the surge to establish a cloud capability in which we could integrate all of the intelligence data that we were bringing in to identify where the irreconcilables were, the leaders of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, of the major Sunni insurgent groups, and also the major Shia militia elements supported by Iran. Very, very impressive woman, Jen Easterly. She needs to get confirmed quickly. And again, then build out these capabilities. And the challenge is that in the United States and in many other countries, you have an uneven level of cybersecurity. By and large, the financial sector in the US has done a pretty good job because they got hacked very significantly, paid enormous fines for that. And so the Department of Treasury, which oversees their cybersecurity, works very, very closely with them. And that's a model for the others. The same is generally true of the energy generation facilities in the country, which is the Department of Energy. But then as you look at some of these other areas, including transportation, and this pipeline is an area covered by the Transportation Security Agency, it's not quite as robust. They haven't built it out to the extent that they have needed to. And there's not the kind of sharing of threat information at real time and a variety of other activities that need to be performed. Now, the president just put out, coincidentally, an executive order that directs a number of different actions, all of which will be very, very positive. Congress is very serious about this. This is a bipartisan issue. At the end of the day, I think what we have to do actually in the civil sector and in the government sector is to develop what can only be described, I think, as a designed, comprehensive, integrated, and managed cybersecurity solution, which involves the concept of no trust or zero trust, as it's called. So, in other words, you don't just get into the network and then you're trusted everywhere in it. You're actually distrusted at every single level. It's a totally different approach to cybersecurity. And then again, also this idea that you have to have all of the different tools and capabilities and so forth employed, but they have to be integratable and then installed and managed and so forth, and constantly refined, because as you know, there are constantly deficiencies that are identified and they have to be patched, et cetera, et cetera. So this is a huge undertaking. Especially because over the last year, needless to say, many of us have gone to operating from home. We have Internet of Things devices working attached to our network, which in some cases have no real security precautions. In some cases have very simplistic precautions. So there are many, many more, as they're called, attack surfaces available to those on the offensive. And of course, those on the defensive have to prevent attacks on everything, defend attacks. The attacker only has to find one vulnerability. So this is, again, a huge challenge for the entire world. The world does have to work together on this. It would be advisable if countries could agree that they will not allow these cyber criminals to be on their territory. As you know, it is suspected at the very least that Russia is aware of this criminal group that carried out the ransomware attack in this case. And so you've got to really ramp this up very considerably. If you actually aggregate all that has been stolen by cyber thieves and so forth, and ransomware and other attacks, it actually would be one of the top 10 economies of the world. It's now trillions, with an S on the end of it, trillions of dollars in aggregate, and growing quite rapidly because the sophistication, the diabolical creativity of these hacking groups just seems to grow very, very rapidly. And it's certainly growing more rapidly than is the sophistication of a lot of the defenses.
Well, thank you. And just briefly, before we wrap up, I would like to have your expertise on the latest conflict in the Middle East and between Israel and Hamas. Are you worried about this new trend? Is there a fear of overall infringement of peace efforts in the region? Because we've seen a very positive developments last year with the Abraham Accords, Arab countries coming together with Israel, developing diplomatic ties, and now there are new tensions in the region. Are you worried that this may untear these good developments we had in recent years?
Well, obviously it is not helpful to that particular trend, noting that, of course, the Abraham Accords, which were very significant and a very substantial achievement, were actually not between countries that were at war with one another. These were agreements between the UAE, Bahrain, and a couple of other countries, and Israel. And the core issue, of course, was not really part of this, although certainly the agreements did stall the intention at that time, perhaps, of Israel to annex part or all of the West Bank, which was one of the concerns at that particular time that was a catalyst for the reaching of these agreements. But what I'm really worried about here is less actually the regional implications of this, which again are not trivial, but the real implication is what's going on actually inside Israel proper. Noting, look, first of all, this is the worst violence out of Hamas in the Gaza Strips, at least since 2014 and the 50-day war that we saw then. It's very significant violence in Jerusalem and in the West Bank. But what is most concerning is the violence between Arabs and Jews in cities that are mixed in Israel itself. And Israeli leaders themselves have been very, very concerned about this because it can actually tear the fabric of society apart inside Israel proper. So this is, again, as serious as these other activities and events are, what's going on inside the country proper is very, very concerning. Okay. You have not seen this at least since 2000 or so, the second Intifada. And again, the potential implications and consequences of this, I think, have to be of concern, not just to Arabs and Israelis and so forth. This has to be of concern to the entire world.
Well, sir, thank you for this conversation. It's been an honor and a pleasure to have you at the Delphi Forum, and I wish we could meet again next year under physical terms when the pandemic is over. Thank you again.
I look forward to it, Giannis. Thank you.